Good afternoon, everyone, and you're very welcome to this webinar. My name is Eoghan from UCD Chemical Engineering. I'm going to give a very short introduction to the webinar today. We've several very interesting talks, so I'll introduce them as we come to them. But before I begin, thanks again for taking the time today. We're talking about energy opportunities in wastewater treatment, and this arises out of research coming from the UCD Energy Institute's program known as ESIP, which is an SFI partnership program involving 5 Irish universities, a large number of industry partners, and funding from philanthropic sources, industry, and from Science Foundation Ireland. It's been running for about 5 years now, and it's going to hopefully enter a further 5 years or so from next year onwards. So it's timely to actually give this presentation, because a lot of what you'll see today is arising out of the completion of several PhD projects as part of ESIP. So ESIP is a multidisciplinary large-scale research program, and the topic today is how energy systems integration is applied to wastewater treatment. So I'm not going to say too much more. Some really interesting talks coming up. You can ask questions via the Q&A button on the Zoom interface, and I'll ask the speakers to answer the questions probably at the end of the session, but if time permits, we'll do so at the end of each talk. We'll see how it goes in terms of time. Each talk is about 10 minutes, so thanks for the speakers for being able to condense their work into 10 minutes. As academics, we find it very difficult to speak for less than an hour on any topic, so it's an achievement to do it in 10 minutes. So we've a lot to cover, so it's hopefully a good format. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Eoghan Clifford. He's a senior lecturer in NUIG Galway and has been involved in ESIP from the beginning. So over to you, Eoghan.
Thanks very much, Eoghan. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully that's visible to everyone. Yeah. Okay, so actually I'm going to be talking today about climate, land use and wastewater treatment, and my topic might be, I suppose, perhaps a little bit away directly from energy, but is maybe a precursor to one of the major impacts on energy consumption in the area of wastewater treatment. So I just have to start off just two, I suppose, figures. One is from the WHO and one is from the World Bank. The one on the right is the electricity access, share of the population with access to electricity in 2016. You'll see that most countries report quite well the data that they have there. And then on the left-hand side, you'll see the proportion of domestic and industrial wastewater flow, which is safely treated. Apart from the number of countries where there is very little treatment occurring at all, you'll see that most countries don't report sufficient data to allow this to be calculated. So I suppose the point being that while water is the primary medium, as the UN has said, through which we will perceive climate change, and that protects the public health and the environment, it is very much, I suppose, left in the background compared to other areas. So the work I'm going to present on today, I'm just showing here a little bit a very high level water cycle. I'm going to be concentrating on the part between water use, whether that's in residences, industry, etc., and the wastewater treatment plant itself. So most of the water that we actually treat and disseminate through the public water system ends up being wastewater, because the proportion that we actually drink, etc., is very small. So the focus of our work in this project in ESIP has been looking at some of the key impacts on wastewater volumes. So that is the amounts of wastewater that enter wastewater treatment plants. What are the key things that impact those, and can we use those key variables to predict what will happen into the future? So four of the key variables will be things like land use, which you can see at the top. Generally, the more urban and not, impermeable ground you have, the more wastewater that you will see influence the wastewater treatment plant. Obviously, demographics is a big issue. Won't surprise anyone to know that the largest treatment plant in the country by far is in Dublin. Then the type of sewer network you have, whether it's a combined sewer network or a sanitary sewer network. So in a combined case, which is generally the case in Ireland, stormwater and foul water mixed together and enter the wastewater treatment plant. With a sanitary sewer network, the foul water is separated from the stormwater and they are separately disposed of. And the final thing then is the actual level of industrial development or the type of industry you have. So in an Irish context, we don't have a lot of heavy industry, which certainly has a positive impact on the wastewater that enters our treatment plant to a certain extent. A lot of our industry is in areas that wouldn't produce, I suppose, very toxic types of wastewaters, albeit there are, of course, exceptions to that rule. So why is this? Why is it important to understand this? Well, increasing wastewater entering a treatment plant can lead to increasing contaminant loads on one side, or on another side, it can actually dilute the contaminant loads influent to the treatment plant. In either scenario, that can result in increased costs. Poorly performing sewerage network that is not capable of handling stormwater can lead to urban flooding. We've had many examples of that in Ireland over the years. Increasing wastewater also requires the development of more wastewater treatment plants, and I'm sure everyone knows that building wastewater treatment plants is not a very popular thing to do. You know, it takes, there generally isn't a lot of public support for having a wastewater treatment plant near you. And it also might require changes to sewer infrastructure, which is very difficult infrastructure to make changes to. Unlike much of our electricity infrastructure, it is below ground, it is hard to get at, and it causes severe disruption when we have to change it. And also there can be knock-on implications then in terms of regulation, particularly in terms of energy consumption, the need for capital investment, sectoral emissions from the water sector, and lack of wastewater and water infrastructure is a severe impediment on economic growth as well. So in terms of this area, there has been some work done before, some interesting work done recently, which has looked at the potential impacts of particularly climate change on urban wastewater infrastructure. So there has been work done in the Netherlands, in Eindhoven, and in Germany as well. And also there has been some work done in Austria. But outside of that, there's, I suppose, a couple of key pieces of work that have been done to date, but there has been very little work done specifically dealing with wastewater infrastructure. Most of the modelling in this area looks at flooding events rather than the impact on wastewater treatment plants. And in Ireland itself, and Ireland is no outlier on this, it is a big issue, because particularly the fact that we combine our storm water and our foul water means that we can be susceptible to stormwater overflows into, for example, bathing areas, and even in Dublin that would have occurred a number of times, in Galway, etc., etc. So in Ireland we have about 2,200 stormwater overflow outlets, which directly let combined foul and stormwater overflow without treatment if there is excess flows. So our impacts in particular looked at what the impacts of rainfall might be on influent volumes, and what the impacts of land use are on influent volumes. That's what I'm going to present very briefly today at a very high level. And the idea is that we would leverage this type of work to look at the climate change impacts in the future. In other words, if we understand how rainfall impacts wastewater volumes now, it gives us a good idea as to what might happen based on projected climate data into the future. How, for example, in the second area, how land use impacts can impact the volumes of wastewater we generate, which can have, I suppose, an influence on urban development plans and the type of drainage systems we put in place. And we would also like to link all this to the nature of rainfall prediction data. So one of the key things we wanted to do in this work was to develop models that could interact with the type of climate data that we can get up to 2100. Okay, I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but the three, breaking that down a little bit more, we looked at various precipitation variables, geophysical variables, things like tidal level, river level, if a wastewater treatment plant is located in such an area, and anthropogenic factors. In particular, we're concentrating for the moment on land use and land cover. One of the key challenges we've had in this study is getting data. Before Irish Water came into existence, data gathering in treatment plants was, I suppose, very sporadic and often in manual form. So we had to go to quite a lot of work to actually get data for this project. And the PhD student, Sakanya, who was working on this project, did I suppose, a sojourn with Irish Water to actually get some of this data that we're using together. In the end, we got sufficient data from 16 wastewater treatment plants that we could use in this study. Okay, so some of the key results. So one of the first things that comes out, I'm not going to go into each of these graphs individually, but we looked at the data in terms of two aspects. One, could we try and predict day-to-day influence to a wastewater treatment plant if we know things like rainfall, if we know river levels, tidal levels, and other such things. And secondly, we tried to look at this data from a higher level. In other words, could we predict the average daily volume over a month into a wastewater treatment plant? To summarize everything you're seeing in this slide, day-to-day prediction of influent wastewater volumes is very difficult. And while rainfall, as you'll see, has a significant impact on influent to a wastewater treatment plant, it is very difficult on any given day to correlate the rainfall from that day to what might enter the wastewater treatment plant. Tidal levels had some impact on, there were some correlations between tidal levels and influent to wastewater treatment plants. That depends on the sewer network in the city. But interestingly, river levels tend to have quite a significant impact and are the best predictor in terms of day-to-day influent volumes in towns or cities that have a river, which might influence the actual sewer network itself. So one might have thought that rainfall might have been a key variable, and we've obviously looked at rainfall from a number of different angles, not just what I'm presenting here, but in fact river level was in those particular treatment plants where it's relevant key predictor. Again, for dry weather flow, which is flow which is not impacted by rainfall. In other words, flow on days where there has been no rainfall. And I should say separately, we looked at lag time, etc., in sewer networks, but I don't have time to go into that today. And again, mean river level was again a pretty decent predictor of what the flow into an influent treatment plant or the influent flow to a treatment plant might look like, even for dry days. And again, that is obviously to do with the fact that the catchment for the river that is going through a town might be quite large, and that in turn impacts river levels maybe a day or two after heavy rainfall events. One very interesting thing that we developed during the study itself was a series of very simple graphs that would allow us to, I suppose, predict what is the probability that you might get a certain flow based on a certain rainfall level. So while we can't predict from day to day what the actual influence might be if we know the rainfall, what we can say, for example, is that if you have extreme rain, which can actually vary from city to city, extreme rain in Galway will be different to what extreme rain in Dublin will be. But we can say, and this is for Galway, that when you have extreme rain, there's an 80% chance around 80% chance of getting about 70,000 meters cubed per day of wastewater into the treatment plant, whereas on a dry day, that goes down to about a 5% chance of that flow level being exceeded. So again, while you can't maybe predict exactly what is going to happen, you can give the utilities a very good idea as to what rainfall, the impacts of rainfall might be in a probabilistic sense. Okay, other things that we looked at, and again, there's a lot of different work behind this, were the number of wet days and dry days in a month. And we found these to be also, also variables that were very useful in helping us improve our models in relation to influent wastewater volumes. Obviously, the number of wet days and dry days are very much related to each other in any given month. But we did find that by actually incorporating those two variables into a model, we did reduce the model area error compared to when we just looked at, for example, daily precipitation and the number of wet days in a month. We had quite a lot of success, you'll see in a while, looking at the data from a monthly point of view. And of course, that might make sense because day-to-day volumes can be impacted by a lot of things such as weekdays, weekends, tourist events, all sorts of things can impact data on a day-to-day basis. These graphs down here at the bottom look at just an example of some of the multiple linear regression models that we would have developed. And what we did here was we've basically taken all the data from all the treatment plants that we had across the various years that we had data for those treatment plants. We've put them into this particular model. We've developed a series of coefficients that look at the the average daily precipitation across a month, the number of wet days and the number of dry days, and try and predict what the average flow to the treatment plant across that month will be. And you can actually see that using a single model, that we have actually very good prediction across the different time periods that we modeled, albeit we are struggling to take on board some of the peaks. Now, someone looking at this with eagle eyes will notice that the scale on the left-hand axis is quite large and that we might be cheating in terms of some of the values down at the bottom. But you can see that even when I reduce the scale and look at some of the smaller wastewater treatment plants, we still tended to have very good success in being able to predict what is going to happen on a monthly basis in particular treatment plants. Again, with some issues in relation to peak flows, which obviously is something that we will be trying to capture better. And there are some treatment plants where we're having more success than others, again, depending on the nature of the data we have and the sewer network itself. So some of the key questions we have out of this is, can we better capture the peaks? Because obviously they are very much of interest. Can we get data from more wastewater treatment plants that we could obviously expand this work? But in essence, simple rainfall data does tell a lot of the story in relation to inflow fluctuation in Irish wastewater treatment plants, which to a certain extent may put our infrastructure at risk into the future as rainfall patterns change. So very briefly, the other area we're looking at as well is urban development. So we are looking at the various urban agglomerations. I've just shown Galway and Limerick here as examples. We classify the urban area into basically permeable areas and impermeable areas, and underneath that we classify it further, for example, into, it might be agricultural parks built up, etc., etc. And we're trying to track the change in the amount of permeable area in an urban in a metropolitan area over time, and see if that is linked to the influence to the wastewater treatment plant. And there have been some issues with this. One of the key issues we're having is actually to do with cloud cover. The Irish satellite images from Sentinel and other satellites are very tricky to work with because so many of them, particularly actually on the west coast, are interfered with due to cloud cover, and that is causing us some issues. And the other issue, which is very interesting, is that a lot of the urban development in Ireland took place, of course, in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, in terms of housing estates, etc. That is the time where we don't have the same level of wastewater data. Unfortunately, for the times where we do have more data, of course, which were maybe 2007-8 up to 2014-15, there was limited development in urban areas during those periods of time. So there are a couple of tricky things we're coming across when we're trying to look at these models. So again, I know this is just a whirlwind tour, so apologies for going if I'm going very fast, but some of the key conclusions we're looking at is that we have relatively low predictive capacity of models with precipitation and influent volume at a daily scale. And while I've just projected or while I just showed you some of the graphs that looked at daily rainfall versus daily influent volume, we obviously looked at subsets of that precipitation data. We've looked at flow or rainfall intensity, we've looked at lag time in the sewer network, etc. And despite all that, there is still quite poor prediction in this area. There's much better predictive capacity at a monthly scale, which in fact for climate analysis in the future is probably more useful. As you probably saw with some of the models there, when we account for the average daily rainfall across the month, the number of wet days and dry days, we can relatively accurately predict what the average flow into the treatment works in that month will be. We're currently looking, as I mentioned, at land use and future predictions in terms of what land use might look in the future, and that work is quite well advanced. And in terms of future work, other issues which we are considering but are not, I suppose, primary factors in this particular work are things like soil moisture, demographic trends, with particular reference to seasonal factors, terrain and network models. We are looking at these, obviously getting more wastewater treatment data. And we'd also like more demographic data in terms of the nature of employment in each of the cities. Obviously, that's all available from CSO, but we feel all these things will add a little bit more accuracy to these models, albeit it's likely that rainfall and land use are going to be the two key variables that we would be considering. We're also looking at the use of various machine learning techniques that we've actually, some of which we've developed in during ESIP in actually fault detection in water networks. And I suppose one of the key outputs of models like this as well in relation to ESIP is that we would like to link this with some of the energy models that will be developed, and Kaan might be presenting on this a little bit later, and some other UCD colleagues. And if we can understand more what influence to the wastewater treatment plants will look like in the future, we will be able to link that and predict hopefully what the impacts that might have on energy and electricity use in the sector itself. So that's it for me. Hopefully I kept it into 10 minutes, and thanks for your time.
Okay, thanks, Eoghan. That was really interesting. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions just right now on that. We may, at the end of the overall session, set aside time for Q&A. I just want to move on to the next talk now. So it's Kaan Dereli from UCD, who's going to talk about energy opportunities in wastewater treatment. So over to you, Kaan.
Thanks very much, Eoghan. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen first. Okay. Let me get my laser pointer. Okay, good afternoon once again. Well, I'll be talking about opportunities for energy savings and generation in wastewater treatment plants. Well, to put things into context, I will first briefly mention about how we treat our wastewater. We treat our wastewater in wastewater treatment plants, and the main objective of these plants is to remove pollutants in order to minimize the impact of wastewater discharge to environment and also on human health. And wastewater treatment plants is a combination of several unit processes such as pumping, aeration, and mixing and heating. And basically sewage passes through various stages, those various tanks, before it is safely discharged to receiving water bodies. So in most of the cases, well, secondary treatment is mandatory. So, well, the biological treatment part is actually generally referred as activated sludge process, and which is actually the heart of the whole system. Well, activated sludge process is quite an old process, but it is the most widely used system for biological wastewater treatment. So it is actually the single most significant improvement in public health and environments. So since, well, it's been more than 100 years since it's discovered, but you know, the main concept is actually still in use even today. So it's basically an aerobic biological process in which the organic matter and ammonia in wastewater is oxidized by microorganisms. So it actually requires a high amount of oxygen, which is supplied by aeration equipment, and that aeration equipment, it consumes energy. Well, if we take a look to how we aerate activated sludge systems, well, the oxygen is generally supplied with a diffuser blower system. So the air is distributed to the tank by these diffusers located at the bottom of the tank. And here you see in the picture in the middle, you see the bubbles coming out. Those are air bubbles, which are actually transferring oxygen to the liquid. And here on the right, where you see the surface part of the aeration basin. So the bubbles are coming out to the surface, and the photograph on the left actually is a typical blower system. So they are kind of the lungs of the whole process. So they supply air and oxygen to the biomass. So, well, aeration is actually the weakest link in the efficiency of the process. It typically consumes about 20 to 60% of the whole energy in the wastewater treatment plants. Of course, there are several other processes such as pumps, sludge processing units, dewatering, drying, and stabilization processes. They all consume energy, but aeration is, responsible for almost, half of the energy used in the wastewater treatment plants. Well, in Europe, wastewater treatment plants typically consume about 1% of the total electricity consumption of a city. And if you take a look to the numbers in Germany, so which has 10,200 wastewater treatment plants approximately, so they use about 4.4 terawatt hours per year of energy, and this corresponds to about 0.7% of the total electricity consumption. And typically, well, these numbers are quite typical. So a similar number was also reported for United States, which is a 0.8% of the total electricity use in the United States. So well, according to my calculations, well, in Ireland, it is also similar to 0.7 to 0.8% of energy use of the whole wastewater treatment sector. Well, over the years, wastewater treatment plant has evolved from basic sanitation to resource recovery concepts. Well, today it's even possible to operate the wastewater treatment plants with energy neutrality and to recover several products such as, nutrients, water, for industrial use, and biopolymers such as bioplastics and biogas. Well, this graph on the right, I took it from German energy benchmarking standards for wastewater treatment plants. So if you take a look into the graph, so as you see, 60% of the German plants have an electricity self-sufficiency of less than 50%. So only a minority of the plants have complete, energy self-sufficiency. Well, in order to achieve energy autarky in wastewater treatment plants, a wastewater treatment plant has to decrease its energy, and it also has to boost its energy production. Only then it can achieve energy neutrality or even some energy surplus. Well, road to energy autonomy actually passes through energy efficiency and energy recovery together. I mean, when there are several options to improve energy efficiency in treatment plants. In this table, I actually listed some of them. Well, for instance, in terms of energy efficiency, more efficient electromechanical equipment such as pumps, blowers, and centrifuges can be used. The process can be optimized in terms of solids retention time, recycle flows, and mixing. And process can even be modified. The activated sludge process has been modified, has been improved throughout the years. So now we have aerobic granular sludge reactors, partial nitrification and anomax processes, and low DO PNR processes available. And instrumentation, automation, and control is also quite important. For instance, in ESRI, we have shown that ammonia-based dissolved oxygen control has a good potential to save energy in wastewater treatment plants. Well, in terms of energy recovery, there are various options. Well, it is possible to capture more organic matter in the process and divert it to anaerobic digestion. It is possible to use co-digestion, adding food waste or fat, oil, and grease to the digesters. It is also possible to use more efficient energy recovery units such as combined heat and power units or solid oxide fuel cells. Heat pumps can also be used to recover heat for cooling and heating purposes. Micro hydropower, depending on the head of the discharge point of the wastewater treatment plant, can also be used. And new technology is power to biomethane, which I will also talk about. In the coming slides, I will touch some of these technologies. Well, if you take a look to the reducing aeration energy, so that's actually the most important part of energy used in the wastewater treatment plants. Well, here we need to think about transfer of gases into the liquid, and well, this has been one of the most investigated processes in chemical engineering. But we're still using diffused aeration systems which have a limited oxygen transfer efficiency of about 30%. Well, I'm going to talk about two novel technologies which can tackle this problem. Well, the first one is membrane aeration. It's basically bubbleless diffusion of oxygen through a polymeric membrane. So membranes provide an enormous amount of surface area which the oxygen transfer can occur. And with that, up to 95% oxygen transfer efficiency can be achieved. Well, in addition to that, a unique biofilm grows on the membrane, which can nitrify ammonia, so that by installing these modular cassette type systems into the aeration basins, it is possible to improve the nitrification capacity. Well, another option is actually vortex aeration, which relies on actually vigorous mixing of liquid and air in a cyclone. And well, aeration and mixing occurs in a single system in this technology, and it is also possible to recover about 30% of the energy, kinetic energy of the water, and further reduce the energy consumption of the whole system. Well, as I mentioned, in order to obtain energy neutrality in a wastewater treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants have to do more than just digesting sludge. So, well, in most of the cases, anaerobic digesters are low-loaded bioreactors with long residence time, and well, a simple way to increase the methane production is basically adding more inputs, more feed to the digester. And it is possible to feed highly biodegradable waste, such as food waste, fat, oil and grease, industrial waste, into anaerobic digesters in wastewater treatment plants and boost the energy recovery. Well, this actually has been practiced in many wastewater treatment plants all over the world. And one example is, once again, from Germany, Grüneck wastewater treatment plant. Well, this plant had about 64% energy self-sufficiency before co-digestion. So after they started feeding, food waste to anaerobic digesters, and also replacing the blower with a more efficient one, they could attain 88% energy self-sufficiency. So it is possible to improve the energy self-sufficiency of the system by simply adding more substrate to the digesters. Well, a new technology in biogas world is actually power to methane process. So I'm sure most of you, is quite familiar with the power to hydrogen system, in which surplus energy from renewables such as wind and solar can be used in an electrolyzer to split water into oxygen and hydrogen. And that hydrogen can be fed to an anaerobic digester in order to convert it to methane. And the whole process is named as power to biomethane. Well, power to biomethane can actually kill several birds with a stone. It can boost methane production, as a result, energy generation. It helps to improve, the biogas quality, and it enriches the methane content of the biogas. So it can improve the methane content up to 90%, and that makes it, that makes biogas more compatible, to feed into the natural gas grid. And it is also possible to store excess renewable energy as methane instead of hydrogen, because hydrogen is quite difficult to store, but methane is quite easier compared to hydrogen in terms of storing. It is possible to capture carbon dioxide. During the process, biogenic carbon dioxide, which is actually produced during the anaerobic digestion process, is used. And it is also, it helps to utilize already existing pipelines and infrastructure. And as you know, hydrogen can be blended into natural gas up to 5 to 15%. But methane is fully compatible, with natural gas and also the already existing pipeline and infrastructure. Well, considering a lot of investment has been made to the natural gas pipelines, why not use them to also inject biogas or biomethane to the system? All right, so that concludes my presentation. Well, I think the main take-home message is actually a wastewater treatment plant has to reduce its energy demand and boost its production to attain energy neutrality. And there are several technologies in the market, and even more are under development. So to achieve that. Thanks for your attention. I hope I was also time efficient.
Thanks, Kaan. That was a really fascinating presentation, and thanks for keeping it concise as well, so we can get through everything today. I think we'll save questions until the end of the session and move on to our next speaker. But just any of our attendees, feel free to ask questions via the Q&A function in Zoom at any point in time. We'll get to the questions at the end of the session. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. So Dana Kirchem is in ESRI. She's a PhD student, co-supervised by myself and Maren Lynch of the ESRI. And I'll hand over to Dana now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eoghan, and again also good afternoon from my side. So I'm going to present our attempt at improving the modeling of demand response from wastewater treatment plants in the context of an integrated energy system, and demand response being the ability to shift energy demand in time depending on the volatile supply of energy. So yeah, Kaan already went through these processes, so I can keep this short. But in general, the starting point for this research is that case studies have shown a potential for flexible operation of certain wastewater treatment equipment. The three main aspects being, first of all, the aeration. Also, Kaan has mentioned that this is one of the biggest energy consumers within a plant, and case studies have shown that this can be turned off between 15 and 120 minutes without significantly negative effects on the effluent quality. The next area being the pumping of the wastewater through the plant, and then connected to that also the built-in redundancy within pipes and tanks. And again, some other case studies have shown that depending on the type of the pump, can be turned off between 30 and 60 minutes without any negative effects on effluent quality. The third aspect being biogas usage in the plant. And here the flexibility potential rises from storing the biogas and then using it for on-site electricity generation. In this project, we're focusing on the first two aspects because biogas, then again, if you don't have a biogas, if you don't have the opportunity to use biogas on site, it's quite capital intensive to install these requirements. So then looking at the power system modeling side and how we can model this, it becomes apparent that in traditional power system models, most of the time demand response is modeled as a virtual storage. What does that mean? So we have a kind of a traditional power system model which minimizes the system costs as an objective function. We have the level of capacity dispatch from renewable and thermal power generation as our decision variables. And then this is subject to system constraints such as the coverage of the non-responsive part of the demand, technical constraints for the generators, and there may be some policy constraints such as carbon tax, for example. And then apart from this non-responsive part of the demand, which is normally just inserted as a time series, we have this responsive part of the demand modeled as a virtual storage, where this part is treated as a storage in the sense that when demand is increased according to an excess of supply, this can be kind of seen as charging energy from that unit. And when demand is decreased, this is kind of according to discharging energy back to the system. So this is what I mean by virtual storage. So then when it comes to, well, industrial demands in general, and then wastewater treatment plants in particular, we found this approach to be insufficient for mainly two reasons. So first of all, it neglects any process constraints that are inherent to the process, and therefore distorts results for the DR potential. So there are intertemporal interdependencies often in a process, as well as input and output constraints that kind of limit the DR potential. So when we go back to wastewater treatment, there's, for example, the wastewater inflow that has to be taken into account, and also the effluent quality that is a limiting factor for the DR activity. And second of all, we find that energy data that would be required to model such a virtual storage is often scarce, particularly for wastewater treatment plants. So these electricity load profiles that would be required can be confidential and competition sensitive. And also, even if we would overcome this, installing the required energy monitoring equipment can also be quite capital intensive. So in order to work around this, we developed an integrated energy systems model for the wastewater treatment process. So we kind of have our traditional power systems model on the one hand side with some renewable and also thermal power generation and some hydropower storage. But then we also have the residual demand as a time series as always. But then we have our wastewater treatment process model directly connected to this power system model. And the main or the two energy consumers here are the pumps and the blower, which I already mentioned in the first slide. So in this simplified model, the influent is flowing into a first storage tank where the pump is connected. And so here the model can choose if it wants to make use of the built-in redundancy in that tank and kind of make use of the flexibility of switching on and off the pumps according to energy supply. Then in the second tank, this is passed on to the aerator tank, which is supplied oxygen by the blower. And here we have the main process constraint of the process, which is the biochemical reaction that happens in the aerator tank that Kaan already described very well. And then finally, after this has happened, the water is discharged to a generic water body, where we impose effluent standards to ensure that the effluent quality is sufficient. So I guess the core of this modeling process is really getting the biochemical reaction modeled correctly, because traditional power system models are usually linear or mixed integer linear programs. And these biochemical reactions are highly nonlinear. So kind of getting these two models together is at the heart of this project. So the integration, as I said, in order to make this work requires a two-step simplification of this biochemical model, which is first a reduction and then a linearization of the standard wastewater treatment model. So we first start off with the activated sludge model number 1, a well-established standard model for the activated sludge process. This model contains 10 different state variables that describe the interaction between components within the aerated tank. And then in the first, or in actually our second step is then that we reduce this ASM1 model to a reduced nonlinear model, where from these 10 state variables, we reduce this to only observing the biomass or microorganism population in the water. We observe the substrate that is flowing in, or say the pollution of the water, and also we keep track of the dissolved oxygen concentration in the water. After that, we reduce this, or we linearize this reduced model to a reduced linear model. So we kind of approximate the interaction between the state variables that is highly nonlinear by weighted linear combinations. So don't be afraid, this is the only math that I'm showing. And basically, I just want to highlight that this interaction between the state variables that you see in the first term, which is nonlinear because it's kind of multiplying and interacting with each other, we're kind of approximating that by averaging the state variables over the simulation period, and then multiplying that with an estimated linearization parameter that you can see here highlighted in red. And by approximating the interaction between those 3 state variables in this kind of linear manner, we are able to represent the process more or less well. Yeah, so then finally, after these 3 steps, we're able to integrate that into our energy water system model, where we have the power system and the wastewater treatment plant model in one combined framework. So just some results for the calibration of that model. So what I just showed, the steps 1 to 3. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we plotted the results against benchmark data from the ASM1 against our reduced nonlinear model. And you can see that it can predict the oxygen consumption, which is on the top, and also the nitrogen in the effluent rather well, despite it's not really seeing the peaks that the ASM1 is seeing. In the BOD5, we kind of fall over our limitations in the in kind of aggregating our different components of the ASM1 into a generic substrate, into a generic microorganism population. Nevertheless, I think we're doing quite well when it's with this reduced model. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that the linearization actually works quite well. So when we are calibrating the reduced nonlinear model against our reduced linear model, you can see that we actually get quite a good match for this benchmark data. So just to wrap up, we hope that this new framework will help to unlock demand response potential from wastewater treatment plants more effectively. We're hoping to get more accurate results for the R activity and its system effects because we can now take into account the process constraints, and we can also take into account uncertainties in the influent. We're now overcoming these direct energy data limitations. I mean, Eoghan has already talked about the difficulties in obtaining influent data as well, but I think we have more tools at hand to estimate this data. And then finally, this framework can also be applied to other industrial processes that have the same issues with nonlinearities in their processes. So when we're thinking about physics-based manufacturing, this can also be a tool that can be used there. So yeah, that's it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dana. That was very interesting. I think you've captured the complexity of integrating an energy system with the complexity of a wastewater treatment. I know you know better than anyone else that it's not trivial. Okay, so as before, we'll move on to the next speaker. And any questions people have, you can put them into the Q&A function there in Zoom. We'll deal with them at the very end. So I want to move on now to our next speaker, Majid Bahramian, who's a postdoctoral fellow in UCD, again working as part of the ESRI program. He's going to talk about digital twins. So over to you, Majid.
Well, thank you, Anne, for your introduction. Just let me share my screen. So hello everyone, my name is Majid and I'm a postdoctoral engineer on the UCLA. A lot of digital twins, how they adapt to develop it. So when I study the operation and see how the data is turning into the intelligence. So before going to the digital twins and study to see what exactly it is important to see why the data, what is the role of data in the treatment plants, and why it is so important. So as we are moving from conventional and old management techniques for the treatment plants toward more smarter and more digitalized techniques, so the role of data is becoming more and more significant. And it is actually, this is not actually the only point. The data is also important for the process control. So when it comes to the unit processes within the treatment planet and the main treatment technology. So to model these processes, we need the reliable data. So these reliable data are coming from the sensors or the operators or from the laboratories or from the historical data that we gathered. But data at the same point is vital to control the planet itself. So as you know that the treatment plants are exposed to the different limitations. The limitations coming from the energy budget, from the discharge standards, from the emission standards, and as well as to meet the demand and response strategies. So all these restrictions are exposing pressure on the treatment plants, and they need to respond properly and expeditiously, actually. So how this is happening, this is the role of data, which is underlined on the unit process that we have inside the planet. On the other hand, also these processes which are connected in a sequence with each other, they also have interaction with each other. So the different dynamics happening in one process and how does that is affecting the other processes, it is going to be modeled with the data. So the role of data is really, really important in the today's planets. So, but the most important things about the data is that the automation and the digitalization of the plant itself. So why this topic is important, why this aspect is really, really important, because we need to predict the future scenarios based on the data that we gather from the plant. So this is vital when we are looking for when we are making a long-term plans. For example, Ireland is set to meet the carbon neutrality into 2015. So how we can do that in the treatment plants? We know that the treatment plants are playing a role in that. So we need to, we need to employ a good data driver and the good prediction techniques to forecast and also to model the future scenarios based on the historical data that we get. So these are the different aspects of the data and how they are important inside the plant. So one of those interesting concepts which is emerged from the digitalization of the plants is the digital twin. So digital twin, as it appears, it doesn't actually replicate a kind of a digital system. It doesn't exist physically, but it is a replica of the physical system. So it is quite old, and it has been around for around 2 decades, but recently it has started to be adapted to the water industry, especially to the treatment plants and wastewater. We've seen a good interest in the research community on how we would be able to adapt this technology to the wastewater treatment plants, especially in the domestic wastewater. We see a great interest in the literature, but in the industrial one, we see and different types of the more like complicated types of the wastewater, like the pharmaceuticals, we don't see that much interest. But in the domestic treatment plants, it is really interesting. It is widely being used among the practitioners and the engineers. Actually, it is if I want to talk about the details of the digital twin, it's a kind of a virtual system that contains all the important features of the real or the physical system. Actually, it has 3 parts. One is the physical system, the other one is the virtual system, and the third part, the most important part, is the data bridge between these 2 systems. So it can, that they are constantly in interaction between each other. So the virtual system is monitoring and they're constantly monitoring the real system, and based on the data coming from the physical system, it is always being updated. So this is one of the main characters of the digital twin, which is not always, you cannot say that the status is always fixed and it cannot change. So we see that the role of the data, how it connects a virtual system to the physical one. But the most important aspect of the digital twin, as I mentioned, is that they can make prediction on the future state of the physical system. This is the point that we are using in our own fields, and this is one of those good aspects of the digital twins, and that's why they are really becoming popular. So if I want to talk about the components of these systems in our own field and in the wastewater treatment plants, so we actually have 5 components. In the first level, we have the raw data. We collect that data and we need to pre-process that data. We know that most of the time this data is not reliable. About 80 or 12, up from 8 to 12% of the data is not reliable based on the literature. We know that this, in some cases, we may see the loss of data. Sometimes these cases could be from 5 up to the 50% of the entire data. So the collected data is really important in digital twins. So we cannot actually rely on the raw data. So we need to do some statistical, some filtering, some mathematical operations to pre-process this data. Like we have some really well-known methods to filter and to remove those noisy data. For example, the wavelength transfer or the wavelength denoising function is one of those most popular functions that we widely use to filter our raw data, or extended Kalman filter, or another methods like the Kirchem methods are one of those techniques that we can, purify our raw data. And after that, we have a storage place that the data should be stored there, and this storage should be accessible through both the virtual system and both from the pre-processing level. So all the data that is being saved is a kind of we have repositories, or let's say kind of inventories that we store the data, which could be usable afterwards. So after that, the most important and the main section of the digital twins is the virtual reality. So the virtual reality is not that much thing that we have in the mind about the virtual reality. Actually, it's an analytic section. So this is the place where the main calculations and the mathematical interaction is happening. What the idea is that based on the data science and especially with the data-driven techniques, so we use data mining and the data-driven techniques to understand the different patterns and to understand the different behavior of the data that we gathered on the real system. this is actually not the only thing that we use it for the pattern recognition. We also we use these data mining techniques for the pattern recognition. For example, we also use them to reduce over the dimensionality of the gathered data, which is widely used in the treatment plants, and this dimensionality is causing lots of overfitting issues in the gathered and the modeling studies. So after that, so as I said, the virtual reality is the main part. We have the analytics, we understand the analytics. After in the next slide, actually, we're gonna go in the details of this main part and what is happening technically inside them. So after that, we have a control action, which is actually the validation of our modeling. And the control action is using the historical data to validate the modeling study. So then we use this modeling, if it is verified from the control action, we use it for the forecasting. And after the forecasting, we use, it means that we comprehended the data, then we need to put action on that. For example, these digital twins right now, they're playing a really nice, and they're showing good performance in the prediction of the emissions of the treatment planets in the different time series and different time spans. Like, for example, for the 230 emission predictions, they are showing over 95% correlation, and that is one of those significant things about the digital twins. So as we move forward and to understand what exactly the digital twins are doing, we need to look at the data life cycle inside the plants. So as I told you, we have the different sources of the raw data, which are coming from the different places. For example, we have the meteorological data. We gather those data related to the rainfall, temperature, humidity, and the drought. For example, moisture, we gather from the meteorological stations. Sometimes we have some data which are coming from the laboratory experiments, analysis and observations, like those traditional parameter and the variables representing the influent characters like the TSS, BOD, COD, ammonia, nitrogen, nitrate, and the phosphate. These are just examples. So we gathered some of these examples from the laboratory experiments. We gathered some of the data from our staff working in the plants, such as the maintenance staff, which are making, observing the pumps and the pipes inside the plants. Not only those, but also all the physical components of the treatment plants to integrate in the proper manner. We also gather their data. Those data could be like related to their relative distances, their age, their installation date, and different aspects. For example, the age, it could be possible. So we gather those data from our staff inside the planet. Another source of the raw data which is coming, and we are collecting them, is coming from the softwares which are available for the modeling and studying the treatment plants. So some of those well-known are, for example, the BioWin and the West, which are using different platforms. We also have some models like those activated sludge models and the extended ones. Also, we have some benchmark models which are integrated to different settling models. We can also use the data from those softwares. So this section is the collection. But as you can see, for the collection of this data, we need different sources. So that data which is coming to our hand is purely raw data, so we cannot rely on that because it is not possible to extract information from that data. So the pre-processing is putting the data through the filters, as I told on the previous slide, and so we get some reliable data. So the quality of the data is significantly important in digital twins because otherwise you cannot be able to extract information from them. So what do I mean by the information? Information in here are the facts and observations that we gather from the data. For example, the time series of the total suspended solids, if we cannot understand the behavior from the data, that data is not reliable. It is totally the loss of data. So we need to have a reliable data. So once we extract the information from those data, this is the time to extract the knowledge, to derive knowledge from the information. So what the knowledge is, that the knowledge is, the meaning is that, are we able to model the information that we gathered from the data? Are we able to put mathematical models or mathematical equations, functions to model those informations? So what do we need? We need the data science and the data mining techniques. So you see the role of the different engineering and the different experts from different backgrounds. So this is really important for the understanding the behavior of the process inside the entire planet. So then once we had the knowledge of the different dynamics inside the planet, the time is for the comprehension and extraction of the intelligence. So what the intelligence is the where the digital twin is playing. Intelligence is that to be able to predict the future scenarios based on the knowledge that we have in the hand. This is one of those things that we should focus, and the digital twin is playing a crucial role in like making easy and signifying the fact of the intelligence and its importance in the treatment plans. And after that, then we would be able to put it in the action. For example, as I told you, the digital twins are playing, really showing good and nice behavior in the emission prediction in the near future. So this is one of those credits for this technique. But there are also at the same time, there are other challenges which are faced by the digital twins, and now it is really being discussed and debated in the research community. The most important thing is the reliability of the data. So some of these pictures that I have here on the top left, you see a conductivity sensor, which is placed in the inside the planet, and it seems that once they are located and implemented inside the planet, they start to action and they start to gather the data which are reliable and which are reasonable, and we can trust those data. But once after the operation, you see lots of the clogging happening inside the sensors, and the sensors are not gathering the real data within the planet. So these are the key challenges facing the sensors are being faced. So another thing, on the left down, you can see another sensor. This is ammonia sensor, which has the same fate inside the planet. After the operation, like immediately after, within 2 or 3 weeks, the clogging of the sensor is happening. So there must be a way to remove this clogging to gather reliable data. So on the right, we also see a pH probe and the sensor, which is also at the same issue. So the reliability of the data within the planets has been the topic for the recent literature. And there are some companies actually working on this topic. So there are some companies are offering some automatic cleaning of the sensors, which is happening in a timely manner, and the frequency can be adjusted. For example, there is one company, Scan, is doing automatic cleaning of the sensors, but they are not that much, what do you say, the performance of those automatic cleanings, like it is way behind the things that we are expected, because the dynamics some of the dynamics inside the planets, they are happening in a matter of the seconds and the minutes. Like for example, inside the aerobic tank, so we have the change of the pH in a matter of the minutes or seconds probably. So the frequency of the cleaning of the sensors is not in parallel or in line with the dynamics that we have inside the aeration tank. Actually, this is one of the key challenges for the gathering of the reliable data inside the planets. There are other challenges. For example, we have lots of the data which are lost inside the storage, because those storage, they don't have the capacity for the metadata, gigabytes of the data which are being produced in the weekly and the monthly periods inside the planets. So in conclusion, if I want to conclude the presentation, so for the digital twins to operate significantly, to operate as we want, they need to access the high quality data. So high quality data can come from different sources, but the accessibility and to be able to use that data for the main interactions and the main calculations of the digital twin. This is really necessary to have access to those data. So of course, as I told you, around 80 or 12% of the data is not reliable. This is in the case that we have gathered all the data in a careful and in a careful manner. But sometimes the loss of the data is also happening, which is the case for the 5 or the 50% of the gathered data in some case studies. Okay. Another conclusion that we can make is that the future scenarios can be relied on the digital twins. As I told you, digital twins are playing good in the future scenario. The thing is that the data-driven technique is implemented inside the digital twin to predict the future scenario. Then it is calibrated and validated by the historical data. Digital twins can be reliable if they have reliable data. That is the thing that we should understand, and we should put the action on the gathering the data and the quality of the gathered data inside the treatment plants. So if you might be interested in the further studies, I have some recommendations in here that you can have in your keeping your mind to look at. So some of them is the first one, which was published actually a year ago, an environmental information system and how paving the path for the digitally facilitated water management. The other one could be the digital twin and its state of the art in the industry, which is also published in 2019. This is not actually for the treatment plants. It is the summary of the application of digital twin in the entire industry and how it is performing in there. So some data-driven digital twins are also the technology for optimization in the process system. There's also a kind of a nice review paper that you can gather some useful information from them. And the last one is also really nice, but it is one of those nice papers in the biomanufacturing and the biological industries, like the challenge and opportunities in the way of its implementation. So these are the 4 papers that I find really useful. Of course, if there would be any other questions, I would be happy to be able to help. That was all. Thanks, Kaan, for your hosting.
Okay, thanks, Majid. That's a good overview of what's an emerging area. So it's good to see that. Okay, so thanks everyone, all speakers and all attendees for tuning in. We'll go to discussion or question and answer at this stage. A few questions have come in, so I'll go through them in order that they came in and direct them at whoever I think is appropriate. So the first one here I think is for Eoghan Clifford. It's from Brendan Murphy. And the question is, given that heavy rainfall in a short time could be a key driver of stormwater overflows, would there be merit in looking at hourly rainfall data? That's
yeah, there would be, and we have taken a look at it. There's a couple of issues with it. Not all the weather stations give that data, and even, for example, between Galway and Athenry, which are located only 20 kilometres from each other, the rainfall patterns are quite different, so you can't rely on weather data from one agglomeration to, as a surrogate for another agglomeration. And the second thing is that you also, I suppose, the data that might be available from the wastewater treatment plants, to a great extent historically would be available at a daily level where it is available. Now, recently that would have changed. I suppose Irish Water would have improved a lot of the data gathering systems in wastewater treatment plants, but of course you do need quite a bit of historical data as well. So there are challenges, and I think the third area with this, and it is something we have looked at, and we didn't find initially a whole lot useful to start with, because there's a lot depends also on issues like the water table, seasonal factors involved as well. And I suppose finally it's difficult to relate that type of data then to climate predictions into the future, because the climate predictions tend to give you daily rainfall amounts between, we'll say, now and 2100, but they don't necessarily look at peak hourly predictions or anything like that. So, but it is definitely very interesting and something as an aside that we are looking at.
Okay, thanks, Eoghan, for that. I'll move on to the next question from Ali Reza. So it's a very specific question, but I suppose he's trying to raise a particular point here. How much electricity in megawatt hours is needed for producing a kilogram of ammonia? And I suppose that's really, a question about the storage capacity of ammonia, or ammonia as a storage. I might put that one to Kaan. I think you might have touched on those areas.
Well, to store ammonia for energy generation, you mean?
Well, I suppose the question isn't too specific, but well, the question is actually quite specific. It's asking how many megawatts are needed for a kilogram of ammonia. But I suppose the point really is not really the numerical answer to the question, but you know, what is the benefit of producing ammonia as maybe a storage in the context of storage?
Well, ammonia is an energy carrier, so it's basically nitrogen and hydrogen. So it is possible to use ammonia in a solid oxide fuel cell. But you know, to strip ammonia from wastewater and to generate purified ammonia, it's not suitable for directly from sewage, but it is mainly suitable for concentrated nitrogen streams in a wastewater treatment plants. For instance, reject water from an anaerobic digester effluent can be, it contains significant amount of ammonia nitrogen in ammonia form. So it can be stripped in a more efficient way and can be stored and used in a solid oxide fuel cell in order to generate more energy. So, well, ammonia is really a tricky subject in wastewater treatment plants. It's generally about 10% of the in terms of load, when you compare the masses of COD and ammonia, organic matter and ammonia, it's just 10% of the organic matter, but it really requires a lot of oxygen to remove ammonia. So, well, I think managing ammonia in the upfront stream of the wastewater treatment plant is quite an interesting topic. In that way, we can reduce the energy consumption of the downstream wastewater treatment plants, and it is also possible to capture ammonia in a concentrated way in the upfront of the wastewater treatment plant, and then then you have more options to utilize the captured ammonia.
Okay, thanks for that. I think we'll move on to the next question. So this is probably for Dana, although I could probably answer this. Well, no, maybe Dana can answer it. How much, this is also from Ali Reza, how much flexible demand is needed in Ireland to address the operating challenges of the power system? And how much wastewater treatment plant in megawatts is available in Ireland to serve as the flexible demand?
Yeah, okay, so this is a tricky one because it kind of depends on what the operating challenges of your system are. And I guess the one hand side there is like using flexibility for frequency control, and the other side is reducing the curtailment of renewable energy sources. And I guess, well, at least for the latter there, I can say that wind curtailment is increasing. I mean, in Ireland, I think it was about 8% in 2019 of all the power for wind that had to be curtailed or constrained, which translates in about 1,000 gigawatt hours, I think. And that figure is increasing, and that's partly because we're building more wind capacity, but also, I mean, we kind of need to cater to that by more flexible demand. The second part of the question, I guess, is more difficult to answer. So how many megawatts of energy demand of wastewater treatment plants is available in Ireland? Well, I can't really say that. As I said, energy data is quite scarce. And as Eoghan already mentioned, they were able to gather energy data for 16 plants in Ireland, and there was a prior project which also gathered energy data. But then again, it is quite difficult to put a number on that. I can only say that there are about 450 plants with at least secondary treatment in Ireland, and that those would be the plants that could use these flexibility measures in the aeration and the pumping that I presented potentially.
Well,
Okay.
if I just add a couple of comments on the energy use of the whole wastewater treatment sector in Ireland. Well, just by making just starting from the benchmark studies that were done in other countries, and also there's one in Ireland, a benchmark study of wastewater treatment plants. Just by simple hand calculation, well, I did this a couple of years ago, and well, I calculated about the whole energy usage. I mean, the electricity usage of the wastewater treatment plants in Ireland is about 116 to 185 gigawatt hours per year. So it's quite a lot. And well, in terms of national electric use, I calculated a number about roughly 0.6%. Well, I'm sure there are people from Irish Water here, which are who are more familiar with these numbers, and they probably have a better estimate of how much energy is used in wastewater treatment in Ireland. But these are just rough calculations that I could do, starting from other benchmark studies in other countries.
Yeah, I suppose I might add that the work that Dan is doing on developing the model will help answer this question. So, it's work in progress, and, as she progresses with the model development, I'm sure that will be in a better position to answer that question. Okay, thanks. We'll move on. Another question, probably direct this one to Dana maybe, or actually to Kaan, because in a way, even though people haven't seen Matteo's work today, the work that Matteo is doing is probably could inspire the answer to this question. In terms of demand response, how much advance time would be needed? Maybe Kaan, you could answer that.
Well, it's really difficult to do. It's also quite difficult to estimate. I mean, well, starting from Matteo's work, I think we can predict the load. I mean, in terms of flow and COD load to a wastewater treatment plant. Well, our base prediction horizon is about 1 hour. So we can inform the plant before that load hits the plant 1 hour before. I mean, so I think that's quite a good time, to get prepared for any demand response action that needs to be implemented. But it's again quite difficult to answer, because there are several different processes in a wastewater treatment plant, and they have their own redundancies, and they have their own constraints. And well, at least in terms of forecasting, we can predict the load to a plant before 1 hour.
Okay. I'm sure the work, as I said, that Matteo is doing, is finishing off his PhD at the moment, will provide us with more definitive answers to that in the not too distant future. Okay, final question here. This one is directed specifically at you, Kaan. It's quite an interesting and specific question regarding the power to hydrogen step and before hydrogen to methane. And the question is, do you think the byproduct, oxygen, produced from the electrolysis could play a role in aeration systems?
Well, I think, well, there are some, you know, this technology has been, you know, it's commercializing very recently, and there are some companies. There is only one, I think, company which is providing this technology at the moment, and it's at pilot scale, and it really depends on the capacity, how much, you know, the capacity of the electrolyzers. So, well, the byproduct is of course oxygen, together with hydrogen is the main product there, and well, in theory, it is possible to supply that oxygen to the aeration tank, but this hasn't been, you know, implemented as far as I know. At least in literature, I haven't seen something like that. But maybe there might be some studies that, you know, evaluated that option in terms of modeling, and that can be an interesting research, actually.
Yeah, I suppose a simple mass balance on it would be interesting. Maybe we could get a look at that. Okay.
Well, it's not easy. It's not easy to say something because, well, so yeah, you can. I don't know if you can just directly supply it to the inlet of the, you know, inlet pipe of the blower, because of the pressure differences and so on, you know, and maybe it would require a dedicated blower system, you know, to supply the generated oxygen.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kaan. And okay, so I'd like to finish off by thanking a number of people. So I'd like to thank the ESIP administration team, in particular, Mary Dereli, for organizing the event today. I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank our attendees for their attendance and their interest, and also for the interesting questions that are thought-provoking. So I think I'll finish there. Just to remind you, I suppose, that ESIP is coming to the end of its project, but we're looking forward to embarking on a new program for another 5 years. We're writing a proposal at the moment called Nexus, and we'll continue this work. So for those of you interested, there's more to come. So thanks again, everyone, and take care.
Thanks, bye.